All right, so I'm going to roll faster through this now and try to not get lost in the weeds. So if we just back out of this now and we go, all right, at the core of this, here's the take home I want you to get from what we just talked about. We have a chondrocyte that's most likely chronically inflamed. We have uric acid that either can be produced in that process from the chondrocyte or it can get there via the circulatory system. So we know that hyperuricemia is in itself not helpful to us. Now, I need to make a differentiation here, because what we know from the 60s and 70s and the 80s is that a fixed average concentration of uric acid in our circulatory system is not the culprit. You guys need to understand that. A fixed average concentration of uric acid is not the culprit. All that stuff I talked about in the weeds, it's going on when we have either sudden acute rises in uric acid or sudden declines, right? Where we now have in the synovial fluid either fluxes that are coming out or fluxes that are coming in that are actively dynamic. That's where we have this arrangement of things that are fluctuating, where we can have those crystals and then the aggravation of the innate immune system that can get to the flare. So the hyperuricemia question, how is it going on? So stepping back, it can happen a couple of different ways, either via production, which is mainly at the level of the liver, right? This is the big producer. Now, I know I've mentioned, well, we could have some production in the chondrocyte, but the chondrocyte is not the thing that's generating high levels of uric acid into the circulatory system. That's going to be the liver. We also can have a substantial amount being generated at the level of the kidney. So it's first liver, second kidney. We also have contributions anywhere else, like from the chondrocyte, perhaps in the brain, adipose and skeletal tissue, but the main producer is the liver. That's the captain. All right. And then the second thing is getting rid of the uric acid is a function of the kidney. Now, some people are going to ask me about, what about the genetics, Dr. Pete? Well, the genetics are complicated, and I think at the level of our establishment, there's this tendency quite often to go, well, there must be a gene for gout. And that's really naive. Is it possible that there are genes for gout? Yeah, there are. And every time I get into the literature, I'm blown away by the amount of genes that are involved in this and the different places where the genes exist, like at the level of the nuclear genome, what's in our nucleus, at the level of the DNA that is in the mitochondria, and then the different levels of genetics. The epigenetic thing, which is how our DNA is packaged in the cell, and how it's packaged is going to reflect which genes are accessible or not. And then at the level of the DNA itself, all right, and then we have this metabolic component. And all three of those things are involved in this. So where the genetics, I think, is having the biggest effect is on the excretion of uric acid at the level of the kidney. And that story is super complex. And I'm not going to try and do it here. We have in the background of all this, all of us probably have a genetic predisposition to gout. Where is that most likely going to have its effect? On the production. Some of us probably hyperproduce the uric acid depending on the metabolics, the hyperglycemia, the added sugar, the alcohol, and the umami. Some of us probably have an issue with that we just make a lot of it. And then some of us, and it could be a combination of both things, we have problems excreting the uric acid at the level we should be based on the production issue. So this is something we have to keep in mind. Now, there is also an intestinal thing, and that has to do with the gut biome. And I'm not even going to try to go there, because one thing that we all know is that the gut biome has a big impact on all of this stuff. But that level of science right now is so complex. I think it would be inappropriate for me to try and even talk about it, other than to say that there are bacteria in our colon that definitely contribute to getting rid of uric acid. But other than saying that, I don't think I can really talk about any more than that. So we can really boil this down right now to production issues and excretion issues. So literally, we reabsorb the vast majority of uric acid that's in our circulatory system. So any kind of interventions that we make on our system, we need to think long-term about it. We want the uric acid to have more time in the circulatory system to get out, right? And that concept, I will talk about a little bit more later when we address urate-lowering drugs. One thing to mention about insulin: hyperinsulinemia seems to cause a decrease in excretion of uric acid. So if we sit back for a minute, we think about what I talked about going on with fructose uric acid in the liver and the generation of hyperinsulinemia and then the insulin resistance. Here you have one of the effects. So right out of the gate, we know we're going to be reaching for that hyperuricemia. We're going to go, you know what? We need to get that down in our lifestyle. All right, I already talked about the diffusion issue. So with hyperuricemia, this is the situation. If we have high uric acid in our circulatory system, then what we're doing is we're fostering the movement of that uric acid into tissues, into the brain, into the kidney, into the synovial fluid of our joints, where that uric acid can diffuse into individual cells and then elicit intracellular effects. This is, again, to remind you that the joint in our toe or our fingers, wherever we have our gout flare, is not the only place where you can have these specialized connective tissue problems where you can have the crystallization of monosodium urate. This just shows you that there are some gout sufferers that actually have crystallization on their heart valves. That's really scary. This just shows you that there's actually a significant amount of data that shows that crystallization of monosodium urate in connective and smooth tissues with these specialized conditions can happen all over your body. Again, we got to pay attention to production, because I think in these specialized connective tissue areas that there is a production issue going on. It does not have to be solely responsible for a gout flare-like event, but I believe we need the specialized conditions for the specific crystallization. And these references is just to point out to you that the data is there that shows that uric acid can indeed diffuse, for example, from the circulatory system into the kidney, where it can elicit, the data is there, where it can elicit the same intracellular systemic inflammation that would happen if the uric acid was otherwise produced directly in that cell. And this just gives you a list of where we know that intracellular effects have been shown unequivocally to happen when we have diffusion of uric acid from outside inside. So the cardiovascular system is a problem, vascular smooth cells, the liver, pancreatic cells, adipose tissue, I believe also in skeletal tissue. Now, if we are going to undergo urate lowering drugs, what's the point? And this is an important aspect of this, because if you go to the doctor for a gout flare, more than likely they're going to say, well, we want to put you on allopurinol, and I'll talk about these drugs coming up, because putting you on allopurinol should stop the gout. That's false. A urate lowering drug is not going to the causative drivers of the gout flare. What it's doing, and this is very important to understand about the laws of diffusion, right? What it's doing is it is instrumentally decreasing the circulatory uric acid to a lower level. And what that does is it forces all of these tissues that have high levels of uric acid because of the diffusion gradient. When uric acid was high in the circulatory system, you flip the gradient. So now the uric acid is going to move from the tissues into the circulatory system. And the more time that the uric acid spends in the circulatory system, the higher the probability over time that you're going to get it excreted out at the level of the kidney. So being on a urate lowering drug can be good for us for this reason. But remember that a gout flare has its highest probability of happening when uric acid in the joint is rising substantially or it's coming down substantially. So when people go on urate lowering drugs, most of the time, most of us will have gout flares in the process of going on a urate lowering drug. That's an unfortunate aspect of going on urate lowering drugs. And there are other issues too that I will address. Now, how do you decide what the concentration of uric acid ought to be? Well, here's the problem. The medical establishment right now is going to look at what they've done is they look at the average uric acid in our population. And the average uric acid in the United States is between 6 and 7 milligrams per deciliter. But when you look at the early data out of the 1900s, the average uric acid was significantly less than what it is now. In fact, the average adult had uric acid between 3 and 4 mg per deciliter, 3.5 mg per deciliter when you track the data down. And so it's my view that if you make the personal choice to go on urate lowering drugs, that you set a target for what the target was or what the average uric acid was in the early 1900s. That's when I was on a urate lowering drug, this is what I did. And I titrated myself very slowly. I got my uric acid literally at this average, and I held ground. Unfortunately for me, I started having side effects due to the allopurinol, which caused arthritis uniformly in my hands, and I had a breakout of rash on my face, and so I stopped the allopurinol. I did that. But I'm letting you know, how do you make these decisions what to do? And I think you have some data. Now, why do people have uric acid these days between 6 and 7? And so far, the arguments for that, in my view, are hand waving, which means that nobody really knows. Most doctors are going to point their fingers. I saw a thing on the TV this morning before the intensive where there was this guy that was going on about, well, we all overeat protein now. And there can be a protein effect, but I just got to tell you right now, when you go out there and you look at the data and you ask the question, is there hard data for how people in the US are eating now compared to the early 1900s? You just don't see this connection with the protein. You don't. What you got are arguments on either side of it with data that's really pretty faulty. What we can say is that there has been an increase in sugar. You can look at that and you can see the correlation, the strong correlation in the data between sugar, obesity, the question of diabetes, and I hate to say it, the rise in gout. And when you overlay the increase in alcohol consumption, you see that line reflected on these other ones. So I don't know why we have a higher uric acid now than we did back then. But if you are thinking about going on a urate lowering drug and you're looking for logic, I think this is a good target. For the reason is we're looking back on a population of people that hadn't been assaulted by the standard American diet yet. And this is what their value was. And that's how I made my decision.